السلام علیکم بینندگان گرامی. امیدوار هستم که در هر نقطه دنیا که هستین خوش و آرام باشین. خوش آمدین در برنامه ما امروز بخیر یوسف جان آزم داریم در برنامه ما و راجع به انتخابات گپ بزنیم و نتیجه انتخابات. Good afternoon and welcome to the Sadai Haq television programming. I'm so honored and happy to have Yusuf Jana Azam on our show today. We will be discussing the elections and the quote unquote results. We'll say quote unquote results because we don't really have a picture perfect, clear calling on our presidency as of yet. Before we begin, I will talk very briefly about Yusuf Jana Azam's accomplishments in his biography. He was very humble to send a very short synopsis, but this doesn't really do justice as to what he's really done. Yusuf Jana Azam is a writer and attorney specializing in anti-corruption, internal investigations, and ethics. He is a graduate of the University of California, Hastings College of Law, where he serves on the board of governors and holds an MA and BA from NYU. He has been a contributor for MTV News, Ethosphere Magazine, the San Francisco Chronicle, the New York Times, Lucky Peach Magazine, and he's also served as an advisor to the Institute of State Effectiveness, working on issues of corruption and governance in Afghanistan. کاش که من میتونستم که امیر ترجمه کنم در دری، اما چون متاسفانه بسیار یوسف جان وکیل است فعلا و در کالیفرنیا زندگی میکنه و این حال خودش به زبان خود برای ما میگه که وظیفه‌اش چی است. Yusuf John, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, that would be amazing.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, you covered it all. Parts that were missing that are probably even more important are I was born in Kabul. My family came here in the late 70s, early 80s. We were small business owners in New York and California. I worked at my family shoe store since I was 6, and that's my first job. Other things that are interesting is grew up in New York City, and actually have been back and forth between New York and California for most of my life. And in interesting ways, my life has kind of come full circle. So one of my most recent jobs in New York was at a place where I could sort of look down on to where my dad used to sell newspapers. So it's a very typical story of, the second generation kind of coming behind the first and having these touch points. So really happy to be here.
Thank you so much. We're so happy to have you. I was doing a lot of research on all of your incredible work, and I've learned so much about what you've done and what you've accomplished. And when I read that bit that you just discussed, it reminded me of growing up also in New York and having a father who really hustled 6 to 7 days a week, starting off as working from somebody and then expanding that into his own small businesses and really being an example for the community. تشکر یوسف جان، بسیار جای افتخار است که شما اینجا آمدین امروی ما امروز و این امی رقم که شما گفتین بسیاری ما و شما که یا اینجا خارت آمدیم یا ای که متولد از اینجا هستیم، مادرها و پدرهای خود دیدیم که زحمت کشیدن، کار کردن، دکاندار بودن، باز خودتان نام خدا ماشاءالله از امون نتیجهش هسته که وکیل شدین و بسیار کارهای مهم کردین. Another thing that I read was that you left an organization, a news organization that you were working for. And I don't think the part about it so much was how it happened and how it unfolded, but more so why it happened. And I didn't really want to be the one who told that story. I would be very happy if you could just kind of give us a brief summary as to, why you left this news organization. I really admire your principles and sacrificing your career for your beliefs. Yusuf John یک ارگان بود بس خاطر نیوز ارگانیزیشن بود و این کار خود اعلام کرد، ایده خبرها بود، ایده اخبارات چاپ شده بود و یک چیز بسیار جالب بود. هر کس میتونه که یک کار خود اعلام کنه، این بسیار یک چیز عادی است، اما دلیل از اینکه یوسف جان چرا اعلام کرد کارهای خود و چرا انتخاب کرد که برای از اینجا این بسیار برای ما یک جای افتخار بود و بسیار احترام دارم براتون از او خاطر. اگه میتونستین برای ما این قصه رو کوتاه بکنین بسیار خوش میشیم.
Sure. So I used to work for News Corp. News Corp's a sister company of Fox, right? So owned by Rupert Murdoch. I've been really transparent about why I went there. News Corp's one of the largest media publishing companies in the world. I was working as part of the publishing arm. So I was working with Dow Jones, HarperCollins Publishing, one of the largest book publishers in the world, and also a couple of their other technology companies. And I was an ethics officer, right? My job was to make sure that that company was acting ethically and people were acting ethically, and the company was doing the right thing and being a good corporate citizen. That's kind of what I do for work. So I went there eyes open. When I got there before the 2016 election, what I recognized was that it was really hard to actually draw the line that I thought was going to be there between the company I was at and the Fox News company, which was a separate company. And even then, actually, to be honest, and I think some people criticize me for this, I actually think that there's not a problem there. I think in a country like ours, there's a place for ideas to be exchanged, and even ideas that you vehemently disagree with, right? And so I again was eyes open in that situation and understood, the choice I had made. Right. Where things got dark was in the run up to the election, because I realized that what was actually happening was a really dangerous disappearance of truth. And I think, when truth starts to disappear, we all have to be able to make a decision for ourselves what we do about that. And at the time, for me personally, the decision I had to make was to leave. And also as an immigrant, as a Muslim, as a father of young daughters at this point, as someone who really is invested in our country doing better, I recognized that I wasn't able to make that contribution when I was there. So I went public. I was critical of Rupert Murdoch. I was critical of Fox. I got death threats. I still get death threats. Wow. I got all sorts of negative feedback. But also, I think a lot of other people came forward and said, me too, right? Like, I also have a problem with this. And there are ethical and moral issues that arise from being a part of that kind of organization. So long story, but also nothing heroic, nothing particularly special. I think people make these decisions all the time. And so, I stand by it.
I think it's heroic. And I think that our viewers also would agree with me, because at the end of the day, what, a human being will be known for after they're gone, their legacy is what they stood for. And we all admire your courage to be able to make that type of decision. It is not easy. That is a huge organization. You could have just kept going and thriving, and not that you're not thriving now, but in that particular industry and in that particular organization, and it could have really potentially just been swept under the rug, which a lot of people do. But the fact that you were able to move past that, and that's a great example for us. And ironically enough, our news channel is Sadai Haq, the voice of the truth. So I think it was really important to highlight that Yusuf John که ارگان مراک کار میکرد و میبخشید فاکس کار میکردن و نیوزکور، بسیار مهم بود که امی چیزایی که میدید که حقیقت نبود بسیار سرش خوش نخورد و تصمیم گرفت که نباید است دیگر در یک جای کار کنه که بسیار حق راجع به چی که مسلمان ها باشه، چی که مهاجر باشه. این بسیار مهم است که آدم از همه چیز که چی پیسه باشه، چی دولت باشه، رای حق باید پیش ببره. و همیشه بعد از این که ما از این دنیا میریم، یگانه چیزی که میمانه نام ما میمانه و کاری که انجام دادیم در این دنیا بسیار مهم است که همیشه در راه راست بریم و جای افتخار ما هستیم. And we thank you for that, and we're so incredibly proud to have you as an example of doing exactly what it is that you're asked to do, which is to be ethical and moral. So thank you for that. So Yusuf John, for the past, I would say 72 hours at this point, we've been witnessing the most important elections in US history. And a lot of people don't quite understand the process. We've had a couple of shows so far explaining the importance of voting, get out the vote. Okay, so now we've kind of done as much as we could, and we're nearing the finish line. Can we start a little bit today by discussing the entire mail-in ballot versus voting at the poll stations? I think that there is a bit of confusion. I've been receiving a lot of text messages, emails by people within our Afghan American community who's a little bit confused as to what exactly is going on. این حالا در شوی پیش ما گپ زدیم راجع به رای دادن، چرا آدم باید رای بده، انتخابات چرا مهم است. حال وقت آخر رسیده و امی رای که دادیم چند رقم امسال آدم دانستن که اجازه داشتن که از خاطر کرونا رای بدن. چی میلین بالت بود، چی in person polling stations می رفتیم. بسیاری نفرها برای ما تکست میکنن، ایمیل میکنن و از پیش میپرسن که خیال چی گپ از 3 روز میشه، مثلا چرا اینقدر طال خورده و چرا اینقدر مشکلات پیدا شده.
Sure. So I think the first thing to remember is how big this country is, right? Yes. And I think when all the votes are counted, there are going to be some upwards of 150 million votes cast, right? And each of those votes is cast in one of 50 states who's responsible for running their own elections in whatever way they want to. And then within those states, there are different counties that are responsible for doing their part of the election, including counting in whatever way they want to. And so in some ways, I think this is to be expected, and it's actually totally normal, right? What's happening. I think what's different this year is that we're all much more educated about the process and the details because of all the complications that have arisen because of the coronavirus, right? And so, for example, mail-in ballots, absentee ballots, not voting in person has been something that's been happening for many, many, many years, right, in various states. In this cycle, it's become more of a focus because most of us have thought about whether or not we should do that as a matter of personal safety, right? And so I think that's actually increased the amount of mail voting volume, right, which has increased the amount of time it takes to go through that. And as I mentioned before, there's different ways states do that, right? I mean, states like Ohio, for example, will start counting whatever comes in basically on the spot. States like Pennsylvania, which we're looking at right now, by law, they actually could not look at anything that was mailed in until election day, right? And so if you think of all the millions of votes that were cast there in person, those have to be counted, and then the votes that were cast via mail have to be counted. So it's taking a long time. I think that's good, right? It means that there's a real process and that the result is something that people should be able to have confidence in.
Thank you so much. یوسف جان میگن که چون نفوس امریکا بسیار بزرگ است، اگه هر استیت ببینین چقدر نفر در اوج زندگی میکنه، چقدر نفر رای میده، اول مسئله است. دوم مسئله است که مثلا شما باید درک کنین که اولین دفعه است که بسیار نفرها که او وقتا نمیفهمیدن پروسه رای دادن، نمیفهمیدن که چرا قدر مهم است. امسال بسیار معلومات زیاد شده و چون معلومات زیاد شده رای دادن هم زیاد شده و این وقت در بر میگیره. در مورد کرونا چون مردم میخواین که خود نجات بدن از این مرض، از بجایی که از نزدیک برن امی میلین بالت خود خانه پوری کردن و رایی کردن تا که او رایی میشه، تا که او حساب میشه، تا که پروسه انجام میده بسیار وقت در بر میگیره و از اونو خاطر یک ذره باید است که صبر کنیم. And patience in this particular election is really important. I know that tensions are very, very high. Emotions are very, very on edge. I know personally, it's been an emotional roller coaster for me. It has been day after day, text after text. There is a division of sorts in our own community. I'm not even addressing anything that's going on outside of the Afghan community, but within the Afghan community, there has been such a divide. And unfortunately, this is causing a lot of conflict in families and homes. And Yusuf Jan, how have you been coping with this? First of all, I should ask, are you dealing with similar situation? And second, personally, how are you kind of coping with all of the emotion behind this election?
Yeah, I waited 4 years for this, like a lot of people. And so waiting 4 days, not a problem. So I think that's where I start. Um, I think on the differences and the charged atmosphere, I think that honesty and transparency and being direct is the only way I've been able to survive. I've had hard conversations with people in my family, certainly within our community, and very close friends, not necessarily about who they're voting for, but also whether they're voting, how they feel about voting against Trump. And by the way, I voted against Trump. I voted for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, and I'm proud of that. Um, and just having conversations about what happens from here, right? Looks like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are going to win. I think that's a great result for our country. I think that puts us in a position of having to figure out where do we go from here as a country, but also within our families, like you talked about. So I think having honest, direct conversations and recognizing that the reality on the ground until a couple of days ago was Donald Trump, that reality is changing now, and we all have to deal with that.
بسیار یک چیز مهم یوسف جان گفت که 4 سال معطل شدیم بر از این وقت که بتانیم که رای بدیم. 4 روز دیگه که صبر کنیم برای نتیجهش کدام گپ نیست. این گپ بسیار مهم بود و بسیار زیبا بود. یکی و دوم از این یوسف جان رای داده برای جو بایدن و امیدوار است که رئیس جمهور خوب می باشه و ما را کمک میکنه در همه کارهای کمیونیتی ما و مملکت ما. و هر کس میتونه که نظر خود داشته باشه. اگه یک کس نظر داره که میخواد برای جو بایدن رای بده سیسته، اگه کس میخواد برای دیگه کس رای داده باشه، نظر خود داشته باشه، درست است. اما چون امریکاست کل ما حق داریم، اما باید متوجه باشیم که چی رقم پیش میریم. امروی فامیل خود، امروی امی نفرایی که بسیار دوست ما هسته، چون وقت بسیار اساس هسته، متوجه باشیم و همیشه فکر کنیم که امو گپ حق گفته یوسف جان آدم باید بزنه. چیزی که حقیقت هسته و چیزی که واضح هسته همیشه باید هسته که So absolutely, transparency is key, I think, in this entire election, and especially with dealing with family members and friends. This election is not meant to divide us; it's meant to unite us. So let's try very hard to bring each other together and rebuild this nation.
Yeah, I think it's really important is that we all have different ideas of what the solution should be, but it's the same problem.
Yes.
It's the same problem. Whether it's Afghanistan, policy in Afghanistan, whether it's employment and jobs, whether it's healthcare, whether it's putting our kids through college, it's the same problem. And so I think the most important thing for our community, is that we have to come together and recognize that the solution has to be built together. And if it's not, we're never going to have a place at the table in this country. And one of the ways that I think this country has held immigrants back is by allowing them to be divided, unorganized, and ultimately ineffective in changing the situation that they're in.
Absolutely. What a profound statement, Yusuf John. The key here is unity. And the key here is coming together for change.
Right.
امی چیزایی که یوسف جان امیال گفت بسیار مهم بود. باید است که ما یک جای بیایم اتفاق پیدا کنیم و کل از اینمی مشکلات را که داریم کل ما داریم. اتو نیست که یوسف جان این مشکلات داشته باشه من نداشته باشم یا اولاد من نداشته باشه. چی که بیمه باشه، چی که مهاجرا که میاین، چی که any type of issue, whether it, like Yusuf John said, whether it's healthcare, whether it's immigration, this affects all of us in one way or another. So I really hope and I really pray that the next 4 years will be 4 years of organizing, coming together, and rebuilding. this is my hope as well. So Yusuf John, now that we kind of understand why it's taking so long, or why and how we understand the voting process, if can you tell us a little bit about the Electoral College and how it's impacting the election results? For example, some of our Afghan Americans in the community are looking at these maps and they're looking at these numbers, and there's a lot of question marks that are out there. Not everybody is as politically active or aware or civically engaged. So there have also been a lot of questions thrown my way as to how this works. بسیاری افغانای ما که شاید است همیشه در کار سیاسی نباشه یا تا بالا نمیفهمن، CNN روشن میکنن، یک نقشه را میبینن، نقشه امریکا را و استیت های امریکا دیش نشته است و نمراست و هر روز نمرات تغییر کرده میره. اگر لطف کنین امیر بر ما بگوین که ایچی مانا میده و بسیار خوب میشه.
It's a complicated question, and I'm not an expert, but I can tell you a couple of basic things. And I'll tell you what's confusing for us sometimes, right, as voters. The first thing is that we talk about being in a democracy, right? And when people think of democracy, they think about direct democracy. So, I vote, my vote counts the same as the person in another state. Whoever gets the most votes wins, right? And the first thing that we realize is that's not how it works in the US, right? We don't select our president based on a popular vote. If we had, Hillary Clinton would have been president for the last 4 years. Joe Biden would be being sworn in. Well, he's going to be sworn in, but he would have been declared the winner already. And actually, several other presidents would not have taken office, right? So the Electoral College, there's a lot that's written about it. It's a very complex thing, but its roots are at the very beginning of the United States, right? In 1787 during the Constitutional Convention. It was set up actually for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons was, frankly, that the founders of this country actually didn't trust that everybody would be educated enough to vote the right way or in an informed way. And so in a very convoluted, complicated way, they set up the system where educated electors, could kind of put forth the will of the people. But I think more importantly, this has connections to slavery, right? And the issue of slavery in the United States, which is sort of inseparable from almost anything that happens and has happened politically. At the time when the Electoral College was set up, there was tension between the North and the South about, the amount of influence that the populations of those states would have, where most people lived, and how votes would be counted. And one of the compromises to, I think, mollify the folks in the South who had a lot more people, but many of those people were slaves, was to have the Electoral College set up as a way to make sure that they were able to have as much influence on who was the president as the people in the North. And over the course of our history, I think over 700 times, there have been attempts to change or abolish the Electoral College. Every time it has failed. I live in California. Some years ago, our former Senator Barbara Boxer introduced, an attempt to do away with the Electoral College. It failed. So I think it's a fair thing to get confused about, because at your very core, it's hard to understand why the person who got the most votes in the country is not the one who is leading the country. And so, but I think it makes sense that they're confused, because a lot of us are confused.
Yes, agreed, absolutely. So یوسف جان گفتن که امی تاریخش گفتن از خاطر الکترو کالج که بسیار کودکش براتون میگم که در وقت غلامی که بود و افریقایی ها که غلام نگاه میکردن در هر ولایت امریکا کوشش میکردن که راجع به نفوس از امو ولایت او استیت مثلا نمره بده و او نمره را استفاده میکنن برای رای. ایتو نیست که مثلا 100,000 نفر رای دادن برای جو بایدن و 80,000 نفر رای دادن برای ترامپ، جو بایدن شد. او را در انگلیسی popular vote میگیم. او رقم در امریکا نیست. چون electoral college از استیت یک نمره خاص داره، اون نمره خاص استفاده میکنن و اون نمره را میگیرن نسبت به نفوس نفر یا نفوسی که مثلا بوده او را جمع میکنن. It's very very confusing. او را جمع میکنن باز بعد از او میگن که آیا اینال رئیس جمهور شده و یوسف جان هم گفت پیش بسیاری رئیس جمهورها بوده مثل هیلاری کلینتون واره که پاپولار ووتش زیاد بود از الکترال ووتش کرده و بازم رئیس جمهور نشد و در شهرها مثل کالیفرنیا واره کوشش شده که امی الکترال کالج از بین ببرن و اگر از بین ببرن بسیار خوب میشه به نظرم. And that would be a great next thing to organize and kind of abolish. So just to further confuse everybody, now that we've talked about the Electoral College and we've kind of talked about how the presidential vote is determined, why, Yusuf John, are certain states getting more attention than other states? Why are there memes being created about Nevada? Why is Arizona a state that's been highlighted? Pennsylvania? در خبرها که CNN یا دیگر چنل سعی میکنین یگان استیت هست که بسیار زیاد توجه مردم طرف از اون میباشه. اریزونا، نوادا، پنسیلوانیا زیاد توجه طرف از اون استیت هست. علت از این چی هست؟ Yusuf John.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think the short answer is that those are the states where things can change, right? For example, states like California have been blue, have been reliably Democratic in the sense that they vote for Democratic candidates for a long time. States like Mississippi, for example, or Alabama have traditionally been red, right? So there's no mystery most of the time about where those votes are going to go. Knowing that the winning candidate has to get up to 270 votes, there are a handful of states that sometimes go back and forth between red and blue. And so those states are, of course, now Nevada, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin, right? And sometimes Florida. And so the reason those states are always kind of in the forefront is because that's where the election ends up being decided, right? Because if you put all of those states together in some configuration and you add it to the states that are dependable for each side has a possibility of getting to 270 and to winning. The reason I think that this election in particular is interesting is several of those states are turning from 2016, right? In 2016, the blue wall, right, which was Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania to some extent, it fell, right? And so those went red for Trump, and that was a big change. And for Democrats, it was really important and necessary that come back into their column. And so there's been a lot of discussion about reestablishing that. And the other thing that's really interesting is that the demographics are changing, right? So in places like Georgia, and to lesser extent, but also important, Arizona, people aren't able to sort of forecast or expect what's going to happen, right? There's a very good chance that Georgia is going to go for Joe Biden. Georgia hasn't voted for a Democratic president in decades, right? Same in Arizona, right? And so I think what's exciting is that this impact of people moving from the coasts, this impact of immigrants getting the right to vote and getting organized, and this impact of turning out communities of color is making a difference. And when you look at where it's making a difference, it's actually in the urban centers in the big cities and in areas where a lot of labor is concentrated. And that's really important.
بسیار خوب یوسف جان، تشکر از این نظرتان. یوسف جان میگن که در می استیت هایی که مثلا نوادا است یا اریزونا یا میشیگن، اوهایو، او وقتا که بود بسیار از 2016 تا بالا بسیار یک تغییرات آمده. هر وقتی که آدم معلومات میگیره راجع به یک انتخابات، همیشه باید ببینه که در اون شهر نفوسش چند است، کی اوجه زندگی میکنه. چند دفعه تا بال راپور مصطفی جان بابکم که خواندیم و دیدیم راجع به نفوس و وظیفه‌های هر کس است. آل یوسف جان میگه که مثلا در هر جایی که نفوس زیادتر شده، مردمی که از خارج میاین، یکی مهاجر، کسی که سفید پوست آمریکایی نباشه، زیادتر و بسیار رول داره. و مخصوصا در انتخابات 2020 زیادتر شده، یکی نفوسشان هم زیادتر شده، یکی رای دادنش هم زیاد شده. این بسیار یک رول داره. امسال به خلم Yusuf John, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the voting numbers have increased exponentially. And the amount of people that are going out, and if you're reading the media and you're reading up on this election, you're seeing how much the African American vote has made a difference this election, and how much people of color have actually come out to support and to vote, which is a very huge contribution to the results of this election.
It is, and I think for our community, actually, where I think that racism is still a very real problem for us, it's important to remember that, right? It's important to remember that if you actually look at all the data after this is done, you'll probably find that Black women, particularly, and men, are the reason that we were able to have a new president. In places like Detroit, in places like Atlanta, in places like Philadelphia, that population, which has been traditionally and sort of reliably underserved and underrepresented and underappreciated in this country, including by our community, is who saved us. And so I think maybe one of the things that can change is we cannot forget that starting January.
Absolutely. And Yusuf John, I'm so happy that you brought up that point. And it's so incredibly important to highlight this particular matter. And since you brought it up, I would like to take a few minutes to discuss it. Yusuf John بسیار یک چیز مهمه راجع بهش صحبت کرد. خود ما در کمیونیتی ما بین افغانای ما یک میبخشین لاحت شده داری بالخصوص نمیفهمم، اما ریسیزم وجود داره و این حقیقت است و این یک درس بسیار کلان برای ما هسته در این انتخابات که باید است که این دیگه فراموش کنیم و این باید تغییر بدیم. I think it's really important to highlight that part of the reason that again, as the host of the show, I am saying that you are entitled to your own opinion, and from a nonpartisan point of view, you are entitled to vote for whoever you want. But since we are discussing how and why Joe Biden will be our president, it's important to say that part of the divisiveness in our community, Afghan American community, is this underlying racism. And I'm not talking about although this also exists, the internal racism between the ethnicities. I'm talking about the racism that Afghans have toward other races, whether it be African American, whether it be Latino. We could go down the line. We cannot close our eyes to this. We cannot pretend that this does not exist. And we certainly need change. We need to break this cycle. And I'm not saying this as a generalization. Not all Afghan Americans are racist, absolutely not. But there is a significant amount, significant enough, that's been shown through this entire election process. And Yusuf John, what do you suggest are some ways, how can we as a community work on bridging that gap and bringing people that have this mentality to the table and changing this?
Yeah. The short answer is I don't know. That's the honest answer. What I think is possible is three things. One, making sure that the information we're consuming is accurate and true, right? I've seen so much misinformation that's been digested in the run-up to this election by people in my family, by my friends, by the Afghan community. That needs to change. The second is to be able to have hard conversations, right? I mean, I know people in my life that are anti-Black. That is just the clearest way to describe their position in the world. I'm not going to be able to change that if I can't say that to them or to you, right? So having some honesty. And then the third actually is kind of having an open heart and thinking that people can change. And if we don't think that people can change, the first two don't matter, right? Absolutely. And so we've had a lot of hard conversations around Biden and Trump and Black Lives Matter and immigration, legal and not legal, whatever. the important thing is to really believe that people can change and give people the opportunity to change and to do better. If we can do those three things, I think we can make progress in our community. But we can't do two out of the three. That's the hard part.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that opening the lines of communication to kind of, really delve deep into the why. I believe that, racism, the underlying factor is ignorance and a lack of knowledge and a fear. There is a very big fear and a big fear of all sorts of things. And in order for us to be able to change, like you so beautifully said, the conversations and the communications need to be opened up.
Yeah.
Things have to, in general, in our community, whatever the situation is, um, whether it's religion, whether it's racism, whether it's real life issues that Afghan Americans are facing in this country, the key is communication and to open up and be honest and transparent. I don't like this person because I'm afraid they're going to do this. Okay, let's sit down and let's talk about why do you have this fear? No, this is they are not going to do this. This is a myth that somebody created within our community, and this is a conversation that's been going on, and people are being misinformed. It's time to inform people and to try to bridge that. Because if we don't, we are no different than, we can no longer point the finger and say, A, B, and C said this. We're no different than anybody else. And as a woman of color and as an Afghan American woman, I personally feel very, very a minority within a minority, feel very embarrassed and very you know, uh, about this issue. And I would like to see us now start to open up the lines of communication to change that. بسیار مهم است که ما همیشه راجع به هر چیز که باشه، نه تنها ریسیسم، هر چی که باشه باید صحبت کنیم. در کلتور فرهنگ ما یک چیز بسیار مشکل است که ما بشینیم در سر یک میز و صحبت کنیم راجع به یک چیز بسیار مهم. و کسی که یک کسی را از خاطر رنگ پوستش یا از خاطر کمیونیتی و کلتورش که هست راجع به زو که ما مشکلات داشته باشیم، بعض وقت زیادتر وقت از خاطر ازشان میترسیم. کدام دلیل داره؟ یا میترسیم ازش یا کسی ما را کدام چیز گفته و باور کردیم. It's time and the time is now. It's 2020 and this has been a decade within a year, I feel like. And if we haven't done it before, I think that with the start of a new administration, with the start of a completely different outview, that we start having these very small, intimate conversations. And I think that they're going to make a very big difference. These small, intimate conversations made the difference in this election. I personally feel like this. All these small think tanks and circles and networks created such a big difference.
Yeah. And Afghano, like we understand this, right? We are also targets of racism and bigotry, whether it's anti-Afghan, anti-Muslim, within our community, anti-Hazara, within our community, anti-gay. There are people, we all feel it in different ways. And so I think one of the important things to remember is that we're not different, right? We're not different from Black Americans or Latino Americans or Asian Americans in that way, where we understand the pain that comes from being discriminated against and being misunderstood and maligned, right? And so I think one of the things that we can do is use that pain actually to develop some empathy and understand that we're all going to keep hurting, right, until everybody pulls together and figures out how to get us out of this ditch.
Absolutely. Empathy being the key word. یک ذره دل خود بسوزانیم. خود ما افغان هستیم. در این مملکت مثل یک امریکایی اصل سفید دیده نمیشیم در یک نظر. مثل دیگر بسیار کم فیصد یا زیاد فیصد نمیفهمم. خودم شخص خواستم یک شهر مثل نیویورک وارد زندگی میکنم and I face it every day. I face it all the time. همیشه چی نامم باشه، چی قوارم باشه، چی رنگ پوستم باشه، همیشه یک کسی میفهمه اینجا تولد شدم. It doesn't matter that I was born here. Doesn't matter. I was telling Yusuf John, I think the other day, that I still get that stamp, the special search stamp on my boarding pass. It doesn't say, it says that I was born in this country. It doesn't matter. We still have, we are being, and that's the ironic part about it. We are faced with the same challenges. Of course, it has to start within our own, our own ethnicities, and start with that. Let's start with that. The racism against Azwaras, or the racism against Pashtuns, or whatever it may be. We have to start internally, which is part of the reason why our country faces so much turmoil, but that's another show. But the other part is that we really have to look deeply within us and say, hey, we're all going through the same thing. Key word, we are all facing the same problem. And Yusuf John mentioned this before. Same problem has to be same solution, has to go toward the same direction. And I'm so happy that this was brought up. I know that this show was, the theme was results and election, but the underlying tones and the underlying theme of this election has been all these issues that are now coming up to the surface.
Yep.
And
sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
Oh, I was going to say, and they're all related, right? I mean, the reason why it's so hard to vote in certain states is because that's an intentional act of voter suppression that has happened in this country for hundreds of years. Because when you vote, you get heard. When you get heard, your sort of priorities and issues are brought to the forefront and maybe can be addressed, right? So that's one thing. Two, we talked about the Electoral College and its roots in slavery, right? And the way the whole thing is set up because of slave owners, right? So in some ways, you're actually, this has been perfect because it's all connected. And you're right, at the very root of it is an understanding of the fundamental reasons why things are the way they are. And in America, the original sin in America, right, was slavery, right? And so to this day, to this election, we are dealing with the consequences of that original sin, right? And so I think that's important for Afghano to understand too, right? That it's not happening in a vacuum. It's all part of one big, long story. And now we're a part of it, right? The question is, what are we going to contribute? What are we going to do?
Absolutely. یعنی یوسف جان میگه که کل از اینمی مشکلات که داریم و چی الکترال کالج باشه، چی انتخابات باشه، کل از این دمی ریشهش اینمی ریشه غلامی بوده که در این مملکت شروع شده همراه افریقایی امریکایی ما. اینمی ریشه کلش اینمی بود و متاسفانه 2020 هنوزم اینمی مشکلات داریم و این یک درس بسیار کلان است برای ما که ما باید یاد بگیریم و ما باید است که در یک تغییرات خاص بیاریم و امکان نداره که ما پیشرفت شویم تا که این مشکل حل نشن. Absolutely. So how and when will we get the so we talked a little bit already about what we've learned from this election. So what are the next steps? So now for the viewers out there who are like, all right, it's Saturday or it's Sunday, it's the weekend, when are we going to find out what's going to happen? And, what will happen from here on in? In all بعد از این all تلویزیون میبینیم کل ما شیشتیم معطل هستیم این all چی میشه اگه بتونیم.
Sure. One thing I'll say is that we already know, right? We already know. I'm not very good at math. That's why I'm a lawyer. But I'm good enough to know that we already know. So I think what's interesting is that we're waiting for somebody to tell us something we already know, right? And there's reasons why Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will wait publicly to say something, but we don't have to wait, right? So the first thing I would say is like, maybe we should stop watching TV right now and go on with our day, go for a walk, and think about what we're going to do when he gets sworn in to do the work. When is the public statement going to happen? My guess would be before the end of the weekend. We'll have an idea of what's happening in Pennsylvania. Again, the lawyers are going to do what they do. It's not going to make a difference. No credible person I know, privately or in public life who practices in this area of law thinks that there's even a small chance that the results are going to change. You might hear otherwise. That's just PR. And so I would say to Afana and the people who watch this show, have confidence that the election is going to be, it's over. The count that you're seeing now is going to be indicative of the final result. And just move on. Think of what you're going to do, both in your personal life and maybe even hopefully in civic life, right? In public service. What do you want to do to get involved with a Biden-Harris administration? And in the offices and administrations of people at the state level, and the local level, at the county level, where there have also been really important elections, right? And so I think that should be the focus for all of us. It's fun to watch the TV and the map, but at the end of the day, we already know what's happening.
Absolutely. And self-care, 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 right? So part of it's so interesting because since the pandemic has started, mental health professionals across the nation have kind of been in need of their own mental health provider, which is it's very interesting that it's as if before it was like, okay, let me call my client and check up on them. Now everybody's checking up on everybody. It's there's this dynamic equilibrium that's occurred. It's so interesting to me. And the reason why I brought up self-care is because this is taking an incredible emotional toll on most people living in this country for many different reasons, regardless of what side you're on, whether you voted for Joe Biden or you voted for Donald Trump. Both sides seem to be very passionate about who should be in office. And, in my life, I've seen many elections. I've never seen this type of emotion in any election before. Yeah, we've had exciting ones, and we've had ones that have been controversial, but not to this level. And I think that it's really important to take good care of yourself and check up on other people, check in on people to make sure, because everybody internalizes information differently. Mm-hmm. And everybody can handle certain things. So I love the fact that you said, just move on with your life. It's happened, it's happening, and try to figure out where you fit in. Not everybody's going to hold a place in public office, but that doesn't mean you can't get involved. There are so many ways that you could be sitting behind your screen and still be involved in this process. بسیار یک چیز مهم است که یا اگر رای دادی برای ترامپ یا رای دادی برای بایدن، خیلی مهم است که متوجه باشی که پشت خود بگردی دمی وقت نانت بخوری، خواهی سعی کنی، زیاد متوجه یکی دیگه خود باشین، ببینین که برای اینکه همگی فرق میکنه، هر کس فرق میکنه، یگان نفر اساس هسته، یگان نفر نیست. So مهم است که همین کار باید از حتما انجام بدین. And that leads me to closing thoughts. Yusuf John, you have been a pleasure to conversate with today, and you brought such a human approach to this. And a lot of the times when I've spoken to people before, they're very concrete, black and white, and they just kind of talk facts, but you really pulled at the heartstrings today. I really appreciate that, because again, I'm going to repeat that empathy is the key to rebuilding this entire nation. Yusuf John, بسیار جای افتخار ما هستی. بسیار خوش هستیم که اقدر contribution کردی برای Afghan American در کل امریکا و برای امریکا بسیاری کمک‌های کلان خاص کردی و بسیار ما خوش هستیم و همچنان بسیار می‌خوایم که یک چیز مهم بگویم که نه تنها خودت سیاه‌سفید گفتی که اینطور میشه، انتخابات میشه، از نگاه نیت صاف قلبتان گفتین که باید است که ما یک تغییرات بیاریم در این مملکت. Which brings me to closing thoughts. It could either be on civic engagement, unification, anything that you'd like to share with the Afghan American diaspora would be very beneficial to us.
Yeah, let me think about that for a second.
Sure. I get well, Yusuf John and all باز راجع به ازی گپ میزنه که یک نصیحت خاص برای افغانای ما که در امریکا زندگی میکنه، چی سیاسی باشه چی شخصی باشه که میخواد که امروی ما شریک بسازه.
So a couple of things. One, I think we haven't talked about Afghanistan very much, but I think this is going to be the next, 3, 5, 7 years in Afghanistan is going to make a huge difference for the future of our homeland. And so I think that like in the US, this is a time to really think of what they can do to help as Americans, right? And there's a lot of things that we can do as Americans. So I think when it comes to Afghanistan, just really taking part in the conversation of reimagining the US relationship with Afghanistan and what's possible for people that are there, and frankly, people who are here from there. The second thing is just building bridges within our community, right? We touched on that today. I think it's going to be really critical. You hear my daughter in the background. It's really critical that we figure out how to bridge the divides that exist between left, center, and right, between our ethnicities, between our religious sects, between people who are not religious and who are secular, between our LGBTQI members, between our mixed race and mixed ethnicity members. We have to figure out how to build bridges. And I think if there's one thing that I would say that I think I'm excited about is we have the tools, we have the right people, we have organizations that I could name for an hour that are doing this work. And I think what's been missing is the will. And I just think that that's what we need as a community. We need to just, grab the will and run with it. And I think we can make a big difference in the next couple of years. And I say that as a parent. I say that, as someone who is a refugee, and I say that as someone who, especially this week, is an optimist. And I think that it's just a really great time to reset.
تشکر. به یوسف جان بسیار گپ زیبا زد، گفت که حال وقت ازی هسته که ما شما مخصوصا افغانایی که در امریکا زندگی میکنن متوجه افغانستان باشه و هر راجع به اشتیاط امروز صحبت نکردیم، اما یگانه چیزی که بسیار مهم است برای ما خاص، غیر از این که در امریکا درست زندگی میکنیم، زندگی ما در اینجاست، حال کشور ما هسته، اما ما هیچ وقت فراموش کرده نمیتونیم افغانستان و هیچ وقت در قلب ما هست، در فکر ماست، در ذهن ماست و افغان هستیم، مهاجر هستیم در این مملکت و باید از پیدا کنیم راه از ایره که هر گروه حزب افغان که در این مملکت هسته اونا را یک جای بسازیم و در بینشان اتفاق کردیم. این خیلی مهم است و یک کار بسیار عالی است و سخت است، اما امکاناتش هست. There's definitely the possibility to do it. Anything is possible, but like you said, there has to be a will. People have to be willing to do it. People have to be, we're definitely able, but we have to take that will and turn it into something that we can run with. And I'm really looking forward to the next phase of this and to move forward. And I'm so incredibly, I have to stop and say this, that I'm so incredibly proud of the efforts of all of my fellow Afghan Americans, whether they're right, left, middle, anybody who's contributed to the GOTV efforts, anybody who's contributed to making phone calls, anything that anybody's done during this election for either side. It's such a refreshing thing. I remember when I was maybe 5 or 6 years old, I would sit next to my dad and watch CNN. And I was so intrigued and interested from such a young age. I could never imagine, especially post 9/11, living in New York, I could never imagine that this type of turnout and this type of unification. So it's important to highlight that many organizations have unified and have come together for the greater good. بسیار جای افتخار است برای خودم، خاص که در نیویورک زندگی میکنم. بعد از 9/11 بسیار امیدم کم شده بود و فکر نمیکردم که یک روز شوه که افغانای امریکایی در کل کشور امریکا یک جای شوه ارگانا get out the vote پیش ببره. So thank you to everybody out there who's been civically engaged in this election, regardless of what their belief system is or was. And Yusuf John, again, thank you so much for your time. and your effort taking away from your beautiful kids and your family. We appreciate it, and we hope to see you again on the show very soon. بازم تشکر از طرف صدای حق تلویزیون. اگر کدام سوال داشته باشین در زیر اسکرین یک نمره تلفن هست، میتونین که در این نمره زنگ بزنین و همچنان کامنتتان در زیر اسکرین نوشته کنین و میتونیم که حتما سوالاتتان جواب بدین. If you have any questions, our phone number is at the bottom of the screen. Feel free to give us a call. We'll try to answer whenever we can. And also the comments, you feel free to write them in. We'll be more than happy to address them. در هر نقطه دنیا که باشین، امیدوار هستم که خوش و آرام باشین. شب و روز خوش براتان میخوایم. خدا حافظ.